The city began with a road where the shadows seemed to freeze forever. The asphalt here did not creak under the tires. It seemed to grow into the ground, swallowing the steps of those who tried to leave, and indifferently absorbing the blood of those who could not. There was no shouting here, not because there was no pain, but because no one wanted to listen. This was a place where every good morning sounded like a test, and every smile on a neighbor's face was a reminder that hatred could be hidden behind it, sharpened like a knife under a pillow. In this city, streets were named after people no one remembered, but everyone knew who should not be remembered here. Every house had curtains, not from the sun, but so as not to be seen. People here did not meet eyes, they hid their eyes, because they knew that even an accidental glance could be regarded as a challenge, especially if you are the wrong color, the wrong origin, the wrong history. The air was thick here, not from humidity, but from the memory of generations, invisible but palpable, sticky like spit that hadn't been allowed to fall. This was a city where the word racism wasn't spoken but lived in bricks, fences, school bus schedules, and the choice of who to serve first. No one called her by name here, even though she had lived here longer than most. She was known as the one with the belly or the one with the dog. A woman with a belly was pregnant, with her back held high, not because she had to, but because otherwise she would be crushed. She didn't wear bright clothes, didn't dye her hair, and always looked ahead, not because she had nothing to fear, but because if you turned around, you would see that behind you was not a person, but a system pretending to be a neighbor. And yet she lived here, because leaving was also a loss. She went shopping, looked down when people whispered behind her back, pretended not to hear the security guard at the supermarket following her, as if she had already stolen something by existing. Her dog, her only real companion, knew every street by heart, sniffed the air, looked for danger before it became visible. A small town where dogs were smarter than people because they didn't divide the world by skin color. But even a dog couldn't predict what was coming. Here, everyone knew everyone else, especially those who felt entitled. People like Mr. Henley, a veteran, an auto repair shop owner, an honorary donor, and, as he put it, an old school guy. His phrase, "I'm not a racist, but," was a password that concealed years of contempt, fear, and power he didn't want to lose. People like him didn't hit. They created an environment in which others hit for them. The city did not need a whip because the air had long since become one. The woman knew that not a single cry would be heard if trouble came, that the police would ask, "What did you do to avoid this?" That her story would be questioned, her words would be questioned, her feelings would be irritated. Here they would not believe her, not because they could not, but because if they began to believe her, they would have to admit that everything around was rotten, and people do not like to destroy familiar structures, especially if they were built for their benefit. This is how the city lived, day after day, week after week. It had not changed in a generation, and it will not change in one birth, but something in it trembled, as if a crack began to sound in the silence. People felt, but did not admit, and it was in this crack that history began, which could no longer be stopped. Because one day, a man, confident in his impunity, got behind the wheel with beer in his belly and anger in his heart, and saw that same woman walking with a dog in front of him, and he didn't hit the brakes. Because he knew no one would stop him. Because here, in this city, silence was always on his side. But he was wrong, this time, fatally. She didn't know why this particular evening felt especially heavy, as if the sky had dropped lower than usual, and was pressing not only with darkness, but also with something ancient, blind, like hatred that needed no reason. She kept her hand on her rounded belly, as if checking to see if there was still someone alive inside her. Someone who hadn't seen this world, but had already heard how the world treated people like her. Her steps were measured, practiced. No rush, no flashing, no stopping under streetlights, no looking anyone in the face. She knew how to behave in this city, because every time she left the house, it was not a walk, but a fight. And next to her walked he, her only comrade, a dog named Sam, smart, with ears always alert and eyes that held more understanding than all the people she had met in this area. Sam knew when to growl and when to just press closer to her leg. He knew that if a passerby looked down, it was good, and if they started smiling, it was probably a trap. He studied with her, felt when she was shaking, and silently stepped between her and danger, even if it was just a car driving too slowly. She loved him because he didn't ask questions, didn't demand that she explain why she sometimes came home with shaking hands, even though nothing was wrong. She'd been in stores where the cashier took her money as if it were a disease, counted the change without looking at her face, and then said to the next customer with false warmth, "How are your kids?" She'd stood at a bus stop when a guy in a baseball cap whispered in passing, "With people like you, it's all clear. They get pregnant themselves, then demand discounts." She'd heard neighbours calling their children home as she passed, as if her shadow might infect them. And she knew Sam had heard it all too. He'd growled so quietly then that only she had noticed, and yet she kept going. Because this city would haunt her in life or death, and so she had to at least be the reason why something would change one day. She'd been home from the doctors today. Ultrasound, tests, questions she didn't want to answer. "Does the father know?" they'd asked without looking. "Is anyone supportive?" they'd asked as if they already knew the answer. No one wanted to hear that the baby's father had left not because he was bad, but because he was broken. People like him weren't given time to heal. They were labelled aggressive, dangerous, irresponsible. He couldn't handle the way people looked at them, and he disappeared, leaving her alone, and only Sam was left. Walking home through the park wasn't the safest idea, but she was tired. Her legs ached, her chest ached. Everything inside her was taut as a string, and it felt like she was about to snap. The park was full of whispers. Even the trees here seemed to know that you were a stranger. Sam walked tensely, tail tucked, eyes darting from side to side. She knew that behaviour. He felt threatened. Sometimes the threat was just a guy on a bench staring too hard. Sometimes it was a group of teenagers throwing bottles and laughing too loudly. Sometimes it was a woman pushing a stroller who changed direction when she saw them. She didn't see the threat today, but Sam did, and she trusted him more than she trusted herself. She didn't notice the car right away. Only when the headlights went out and the screech of tyres on gravel made Sam flinch did she look up. A black car, old, with cloudy windows. It stopped not next to her, but a little further away, just far enough away to not arouse suspicion, but not too far either. She thought, just someone smoking. But Sam growled, and it wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. Then she tightened her grip on the leash and walked faster. But there was a voice behind her, a man's, rough, provocative. "Hey honey, are you sure you know how to raise a dog? Or are you going to rely on white people for help again?" She didn't answer. Never answer. An answer is an invitation. Silence is armor. But he went on. "Does your dog even know that his owner is a parasite?" He laughed. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of power. The laugh of a man who knows that nothing will happen to him. She clenched her teeth. Her baby twitched inside her. Sam became like a spring. Then, a screech of metal. The car screeched, straight at them, not quickly, but with intent. She managed to yank the leash. Sam jerked. The headlights were like a floodlight of torture. She heard a crunch. She didn't understand it at first. She just felt the leash slip from her hand. Then a squeal. Not human. Her heart stopped. She screamed, but the sound seemed to disappear into the night. The car drove on without stopping. Her dog was left lying on the asphalt. She didn't know if she was alive or not. She just dropped to her knees. She pressed her forehead against the wet fur. The world shrank to a pulse that was fading under her hands. Her mouth whispered a name. Sam. Sam. But the sound was empty. As empty as this whole city. And then she understood. They didn't just want her to suffer. They wanted her to disappear. And if she didn't disappear, they would have to find out what a woman is capable of when the only man who loved her was killed. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from and whether something similar has happened in your life. It is important for us to know that you are with us. Don't forget to subscribe so as not to miss the continuation. We continue. Night didn't fall in this city. It crept up. Slowly, like something sticky, viscous, like a curse that couldn't be washed away. It wasn't dark. It was thick, filled with silent stares from windows, the clink of empty bottles in backyards, the occasional slam of doors and even rarer footsteps. People didn't get lost in this night. They hid in it. And when it came, it was better for people like it to be home. But today it walked, not from recklessness, from fatigue. When you're tired of being afraid, you simply stop counting the threats. Her dog was no longer walking beside her. It stayed in the road. Her heart was still broken, but anger pulsed in her hands. She thought there would only be pain from now on, but the city decided that wasn't enough. It sent out its next executioner. The car appeared the way hatred usually does. Suddenly, silently, without warning. There were no headlights, no music, barely even an engine, just the crunch of gravel under the wheels and the darkness that moved like an animal. At first she thought it was a random driver. You never know who drives at night. But then the car slowed down. Slowed the way a man's gaze slows when he looks at a woman not as a person, but as an object. Slowly, expectantly. Then, a stop and silence. Even the air froze. She felt something inside her shrink. Instinct said, "Run." But she couldn't. Not because she didn't want to, because she was pregnant, and because she still hoped that it was just a coincidence. The car stood for a few seconds, and then a jerk. No lights, no signal. She didn't even see it completely. Only a silhouette, only a black rectangle flying at her. In that moment, the past and the future converged at one point. It was not an accident. It was a choice. He knew who he was hitting. He saw her. He saw her skin color, her face, her loneliness. He saw the dog, and he still stepped on the gas, because he was sure he would get away with it, because no one in this town punishes a white man for making a mistake. Because if she died, they would say to her, "What were you doing out there at night?" The car sped past, its side mirror hitting her arm. She didn't fall, but she screamed. Her scream wasn't just from pain, it was from understanding. It wasn't an act of anger or drunk driving. It was a manifesto. It was someone who wanted to tell her, "You are nothing." The car window glinted in the dim streetlight, and she saw a face, for a split second. A man, white, balding, red face, a smile, not angry, satisfied, like a hunter who's shot game. He didn't slow down. Instead, he accelerated. She remained standing. Her hand ached. Her stomach stirred. Her heart furiously. She knew this man, not by name, but by type. He was the kind of man who looked at you like you were a statistic, the kind who would sit at the bar and say, "This didn't used to happen," before all these people moved in. The kind who would smile at meetings and say, "We're all equal here," and then vote to repeal the school curriculum that teaches about slavery. He was the kind of man who went to church and then wrote on social media that these people are asking too much. He was the face of this city, the real deal, the unflattering one. And she realized this wasn't just an attack. It was a warning, silent but clear. "We're watching. We don't want you here. You need to know your place." She was shaking, but not with fear. Something else was rising inside her, stronger, like the earth about to break apart. She looked up. The car disappeared into the darkness like a rat in a pipe. But she already knew. This is not the end. This is a challenge. This city wanted her to break, but it was wrong, because she had already passed the point where she could be afraid. Her dog was dead. The child was under her heart, and all she had left was her will. She took out her phone. No police. They wouldn't help. They would say, "Are you sure this wasn't just an accident?" They would ask, "Didn't you provoke it?" She knew that her story would not be included in the protocol. If she wanted justice, she would have to become a storm. She took a photo of her hand. A bruise was already swelling. A photo of the road, tire tracks. A photo of the car, partially, but the license plate was visible. Her fingers were shaking, but she typed. This was not a complaint. This was the beginning. The beginning of something the city had never seen. She didn't know how it would all end, but she knew one thing. She would not stop now. The darkness came upon her, and she would be light or fire. She couldn't stop. As soon as she got up from the asphalt, despite her cut knees, without stopping for a second, she realized that there was nothing ahead but emptiness. Only Sam, her dog, was lying there, and she couldn't leave him. He was all she had, and he was dying right in her arms, like a wounded animal that didn't have time to understand that he was caught. She clutched his body to her chest like the last straw, the last hope that could somehow warm her heart, which suddenly turned out to be not so strong. Sam was moaning quietly. His eyes, full of pain and fear, no longer saw the world, but they looked at her, and she could do nothing to save him. He was her protector, her only friend in this cruel world, and now he was dying, and no one heard her scream. She sobbed. But these tears were not tears of pain only. They were tears of anger, of rage. She knew that everything that was happening was not an accident. It was a consequence. Every action she took, every word she said, they still didn't consider her a person. The town didn't consider her a person, any more than they considered her dog. And even now, with Sam dying in her arms, no one had come to help. She looked out the window, but she didn't see a single living person. For a moment, it seemed like every window, every door was locked. In that moment, she felt like she didn't exist for them at all. She was a stranger to these people, as if she was never meant to be in their world. When she looked out the window of the nearest house, she saw the person inside turn around, notice her, but only close the curtains. She screamed. It wasn't just a scream of pain, it was a scream of despair, a scream that couldn't be heard, because it wasn't meant for this world. It was meant to stay inside her, to tear her apart from the inside. She looked at Sam again. His body was lifeless, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel like all was not lost. She knew that if she didn't do this, if she didn't bring them all into the light, nothing would change. Her phone was shaking in her hand. She dialed the number, but before she sent it, she froze. Her fingers couldn't move anymore. The police. She knew it wouldn't help. She knew they would just file a report. They would say that they couldn't interfere, that they didn't see any evidence of a crime. It wasn't the first time she'd felt their coldness. The police wouldn't act. They wouldn't save her. She tried to convince herself that nothing would change, that her screams would go unheard. But she couldn't stop. She tried dialing the number again, the phone in her hand again. But she didn't expect an answer anymore. She knew that even if she lived until tomorrow, they wouldn't believe her. Even if she managed to tell them what had happened, her words would be put aside. The whites would be right, as always. The one to blame wouldn't be the one who hit her dog, but the one who yelled at her, who didn't want to be in her place. She already knew that, but that didn't mean she would give in. Sam was her last proof, her last voice trying to wake up the world that the existence of people like her was valuable. But he was dying, and she couldn't save him. "Please help me," she whispered into the phone, but her words were powerless. She was too small in this world. She knew it. She had felt it since the first day she came here. These walls, these looks, these words, all of it made her feel like an outsider, leaving this place with every step. But no matter how much it hurt, she couldn't stay in the shadows. She had to survive. She had to be someone. Her scream wasn't empty. She had to tell the whole world that her life mattered. But to do this, she had to go through everything. Through fear, through humiliation, through misunderstanding, through the same horror that she had known since childhood. Sam died in her arms. She couldn't save him, but she knew that he would not die in vain. He was her last straw, her last hope that this world could change. She put the phone away and put it in her pocket. She looked at the empty houses where those who had never looked in her direction lived. There was no pity in their eyes. There was fear in their eyes, fear that they could lose their place. And she knew that there would be no forgiveness, but she wasn't going to ask for forgiveness either. All that was left was the only strength that did not depend on power, on money, and on other people's views. It was her will, her desire to fight, her determination not to give up, even when the whole world refused to hear her. And although her scream was not heard at that moment, it still broke the silence. All she could do was keep going, even if there was no one around. The man behind the wheel knew his place in this town was set. His place was not just behind the bar, but in the minds of those who believed that everything they had was the result of living righteously. For he was their example, their ideal. He knew that he was in no danger. He had the money behind him. His connections spread throughout the town like the roots of an old tree. His family had been here for generations, and his grandfather was said to have been one of those who raised this town on those below. People feared him. People respected him. He stood aside while the town chewed up strangers, while their destinies crumbled, and he knew that his hands were clean. Whatever happened was none of his business. There was no sin in what he did not do. He was right because he was white. He was the one who made the rules, because his opinion was the only one that mattered. That evening, as usual, he sat at the bar, staring into his glass of cheap beer, and reasoned. He knew that his words were law. His laughter rang out loudly, as if he were laughing not at something funny, but at something that had long since become normal for him. He told a story that was normal for him, a story about how he taught a lesson to yet another guest of their neighborhood. He told how this woman, an African American, with her dog, had torn his nerves, and how he had once again proven to these people that they had no place among the normal. He spoke of it as a victory, with an expression as if his action was not just justified but praised. He laughed, pausing until his friends laughed with him. He knew that they would appreciate it. He felt important, in charge. He knew that people like her could not only be looked down upon, but also controlled, without fear of consequences. In his eyes, she was just an object that happened to be out of place, in a territory that was meant for others, for white people. He knew she shouldn't have been out on that street. He knew her place was in another city, far away. He felt like he was doing society a favor by keeping people like her from destroying what they had built. He knew he didn't have to apologize. He didn't have to justify himself. He knew he didn't have to answer for his actions. He was sure his place was indisputable, because in his world, she wasn't human. She was just another exception. He didn't question it. He didn't feel guilty. He drank his beer, and his laughter grew louder. It was the laughter of a winner. He knew that this woman, this outsider, couldn't do anything to destroy his world. He was sure that she couldn't affect his place in this life. He knew that even if she went to the police, nothing would change. The police would be on his side. She always had. His father was one of the people who financed the police patrols in this area. He knew that no law would touch him. His friends knew it too, and when he told them his story, they supported him. They supported him not because they thought he was right, but because it was easier, because they all knew who was really right here. They were all in his circle. They were all part of what he created, and everything that happened around them was just a background for them. A picture that they did not see until she began to disturb the order. He did not know what was happening to a woman he did not like. All he knew was that she did not belong here, and like all the others, she needed to be returned to the place from which she came. He closed his eyes, listening to the laughter of his friends. At that moment, his phones began to vibrate. He did not pay attention to them because they were not important. At that moment, when his eyes opened again, he saw one of his friends stand up and walk to the door. "Is her body there?" he asked. "What did you say?" "You mean the woman with the dog? You said we taught her a lesson." "Oh, you mean her?" He chuckled. "She's not worth feeling sorry for." He picked up the glass again and raised it to his lips. "That's what I thought. You're always somehow with them. You know that's normal here, right? People like me run this town, and anyone who gets in your way will forget their role." The woman had left her dog dying on the sidewalk, and yet she wouldn't have done anything to change the situation. He knew he was innocent. He was as sure of it as he was of being right. People come and go, but he remains. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from and whether you have ever experienced something similar in your life. It is important for us to know your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. When she called the police, her voice was shaking with pain and despair. Every word was difficult, as if she herself could not believe what was happening. She told it all like it was, how the car had hit her dog, how the driver had not slowed down, had not looked in the rearview mirror, had not looked into the eyes of the woman whose dog was dying in her arms. She said that he was white, that he was a local. She said that he was the one who walked the streets without paying attention to others, the one who thought that the world belonged to him. She did not expect to be taken seriously. She knew that the color of her skin was already a death sentence, but she still hoped that at least they would come, that at least someone would do something. But as soon as the police car pulled up, she realized that this was not what she was expecting. At first, it was something unnoticeable, like a thin crack in the glass. She heard the police discussing her case among themselves, standing a few feet away, oblivious to her presence. She heard them say, "The dog jumped out on its own. It wasn't his fault. He was a local, and they all knew him." "A pregnant woman in hysterics," one of them said. "A woman with a dog. Evening." She certainly couldn't process what was happening. As they approached her, she felt the pressure increase. It was one thing to be humiliated on the street, to be a stranger among strangers, but when you saw them trying to turn your pain into an insignificant fact, it was quite another. She tried to talk, she tried to explain, but they just threw the words at her like dust in her face. "The dog jumped out on its own," they repeated again. Yes, we've all seen those. She just didn't see the car." As if all she could say was the complaint of a hysterical woman who hadn't realized that it was just an accident. In their eyes, her tears were not proof of pain, but proof of her weakness, her inability to cope. In their eyes, she was nothing more than another woman who could not properly understand what had happened. She was wrong, she was pathetic, and no one considered her a person who deserved justice. He was one of their kind. He was the one who was not afraid, who knew that all this could be easily hushed up. She felt her own story getting lost in their words. Everything she had been through, all this pain, it was already forgotten. They looked at her as someone who was simply interfering with their case. The police had simply written down a report, recorded an accident, and nothing more. She tried to get them to do something, but they simply told her that it was none of their business, that dogs sometimes run into the road, and in such a situation, no one can guarantee safety. They did not even ask for the license plate number of the car. They did not even ask what evidence she had. In their eyes, she was just another woman who had to come to terms with what had happened. The police knew who he was. They knew he had connections, that his father was one of the people who sponsored many of the areas. They knew he was one of those people who would not be held accountable. In the end, she realized she was nothing to them. Her tears did not matter. She was just a lived moment. And she realized that she herself did not matter to the system. She was just a bargaining chip, a pawn in someone's game. And her pain was not something they were willing to take seriously. All they did was write up a report and leave. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not scream. She stood silently. He was right. He was part of the system. The system was on his side. It was not that difficult to understand. She felt her whole life compressed into those few minutes. How she was just another element in a chain that kept moving despite her resistance. She couldn't hope for help anymore. She realized that her whole life was a fight against windmills, against a force that was not on her side from the start. And in that moment, she realized that this story would not end here. But she also realized that now she had to fight, not for herself, but for them to hear her. Even if her words and her tears were not heard, she could not just leave. She had to make them hear, even if they could not understand her. She was silent, and it wasn't because she had no words. She was silent because words were powerless. Words are what you say when you still hope for someone else's help. She no longer hoped. She no longer believed. She stood with her head bowed and thought about what was happening to her. That she had become different. That she would no longer be able to return to the world that once seemed normal. She would no longer look at people as equals. She would no longer wait for someone to squeeze her hand and say, "I'm with you." Because her heart was filled not only with pain, but with something else. Something she had never felt before, but now knew that it was her only strength. Anger. She couldn't forgive. It wasn't just about her dog. It was about everything that had happened to her entire life. About the looks, about the words, about how every day she felt like a stranger, like she wasn't allowed to be here. The anger was in her chest, in her arms, in her legs, in her heart. And it was quiet, slow, like a river that doesn't make noise, but destroys everything in its path. The anger was internal. It didn't scream. It didn't burst out. It didn't demand an answer. It was in the shadows. It grew. It filled her completely. And in that moment, she realized that she was not a victim. She was not a weak woman standing in the shadow of her past. She was a person who was now standing, and that person was ready to take what was rightfully his: justice. But she understood that justice doesn't come. It only comes when you take it. It has always been an illusion that made people think they could be saved. But it can't be saved. It can't be waited for. It was what they called the inconvenient truth. And if she wanted justice, she didn't have to wait for someone to say, "You're right." She had to show everyone that she was right. But to do that, she had to first accept that she would not be forgiven. She would not forgive those who looked down on her. She would not forgive those who destroyed her world. She would not forgive those who killed her dog and did not consider her life, but considered her just an object. She would not forgive those who told her, "You must accept it." But she remained silent, because her silence was stronger than any word. A silence in which every breath she took became a scream. A silence that gave her strength. A silence that allowed her to collect herself. She did not get angry right away. She did not scream, did not destroy everything around her. She closed herself off. She collected everything within herself. But what was inside her was ready to break out. It was not just rage. It was a scream that no one heard. And she wasn't going to let them keep her silent. She already knew that no one would treat her like a human being. She knew it the moment the police left without taking her words seriously. She knew it the moment they wrote up the report without being interested in her evidence. She knew it the moment she tried to fight and was told that she had no right to fight, that her place was in the shadows. She knew at that moment that this world would never give her a place. But she didn't want to be a part of this world anymore. She wasn't going to wait to be crushed again, to go back to her life and look at those who left her alone, to listen to the same words, the same looks, the same orders. She was ready to fight. She was ready to take what was supposed to be hers. And it wasn't about revenge. It was about not being ignored anymore. It was about not being called a survivor anymore. It was about finally being heard. But she knew they wouldn't hear her. She knew her anger wouldn't be taken seriously, but it didn't matter. She knew it was her path. And now there was only one path. It was hers. And she couldn't be in the shadows anymore. There was power in her. Power she couldn't and wouldn't hide any longer. And in her silence, there was a scream no one could hear. But they would hear it when it was too late. She wasn't the only one. That was the first thing she realized when she started looking for people who could tell her story. She wasn't the only one who had encountered this shadow, this silence that swallowed up everything that went beyond what was allowed. She began to gather people, those who could no longer remain silent, who could no longer watch their lives turn into a farce, witnesses, people who had seen what was happening to her dog, to her grief. They didn't scream. They were silent, just like her. But silence was no longer a weapon. It was restraining. It was striking. And now it was becoming a weapon. She knew that if she wanted to break out of this shadow, she had to gather those who had gone through the same walls of silence. She searched, and she found. Not everyone, but those who were ready to take a step. They came without explaining, without asking. There were few of them, but it was enough. They each knew that if they remained silent, their lives would remain as they were, empty, drawn out, and restless. They had been afraid all this time, but they could no longer be afraid. She looked at them and felt their gaze change. They no longer tried to hide their silence. It had turned to anger. Anger that grew from what they saw, what was happening around them, what was happening to her. They did not shout. They did not argue. They prepared. They understood that one voice would not change anything, that one person could not break the system. But if they united, If they showed the world that their silence would no longer hold them back, then they could do something. She sought witnesses not only among those who had been there, who had seen what had happened to her dog, but also among those who had been there, who had seen her struggle, her life, her struggle with this city, with this system, with this gaze they imposed on her. She was looking not just for people who could confirm her words, but for those who were willing to support her, who were willing to look at it without fear. And they came. They began to understand. But it was not easy. It was not instantaneous. It was a process. But when she began to gather people, when she began to write down their words, when they began to say what had been hidden for too long, what no one knew, what they had heard inside themselves for so long, that the silence was just a deception, it began to crumble. The legend of the good neighbor who does no harm to anyone, who always finds a solution, who always helps, began to crack. Those who looked at her with their heads held high, with satisfied smiles, with confidence in their right to look down on others, began to lose their fortitude. Those who saw in this city only a perfect picture began to see it in cracks. When the neighbors started talking, when they started revealing what they had hidden for so long, when they started telling how they had been systematically ignored, when they started telling how the racism in their town was not hidden but built into every street, every yard, every smile, it all became hateful to those who thought they had the right to decide who belonged there. Nothing happened right away. But the first cracks began to appear. The legend that had lived in this town for years began to crumble. And the man who had been sure that his place in this town was forever secured, that his connections, his money, and his power could not be challenged, began to realize that something was changing. He did not notice it right away, but she saw how people who had previously remained silent began to look him in the eye openly. She saw how those who had once raised a glass in his honor now turned around and walked away. She saw his world begin to crumble, his confidence that he could do whatever he wanted to. People begin to crack. She saw it, but she didn't rejoice. She knew it was only the beginning. She knew she was part of it. She was part of what wouldn't let him be silent anymore, wouldn't let him stay in the shadows. That first blow wasn't physical. It was a blow to his confidence, to his hypocrisy, to his power. She knew that justice doesn't come by itself, but she knew that she could be the one to lift the first stone, to break down the wall behind which those who thought they could do anything always hid. And that stone was the first blow they all felt. And she felt it changing everything around her. This was her moment. She didn't yet know what would happen next, but she felt it. They would no longer look at her as a stranger, and she felt that stone turn into an avalanche. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from and whether you have ever experienced something similar in your life. It is important for us to know your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. When the system is silent, when corrupt laws cannot or will not protect, those who stand outside this system appear. At that moment, when she failed to obtain the truth through official channels, she understood. Her revenge, her justice cannot be put into someone else's hands. She will not wait for those who hide behind suits and badges to finally come to the conclusion that her life matters. If this system does not work for her, then she must work herself. And those who offended her, those who humiliated her, who laughed at her grief, must answer for it. This was not about revenge, this was about justice. And justice, as she understood, does not come in a uniform. It comes in the night, in anonymous messages, in those gestures that leave no trace, but leave a memory. This was what had started after her words had fallen on deaf ears, after her story had been ignored by the police, after her dog had been left in her arms after all those who could help had turned their backs. She was not alone. Those who were there and those who could not stand by had taken action. Anonymous threats had started pouring in. His business phone had filled with messages, more and more by the minute, more and more by the hour. He had tried to ignore them, but the more he tried to brush them off, the more pressure there was. He had gritted his teeth, thinking that this was just temporary. But time was not his friend. Every ad he posted now had strange comments. Every post he made had people ready to tear his reputation apart. He didn't know who they were, and it scared him. His business was suffering. He started losing clients who had previously considered him not just normal, but part of the elite, part of those who understand how this world works. At first, these were small oddities. Someone cancelled orders, someone refused services. But then it began to mount. People he knew, who had never doubted his words before, began to turn away. They did not tell him directly, but he knew that their silence was his death sentence. He was sure that he was untouchable, but now he saw that even the strongest walls were beginning to crack. When his car appeared on the streets, people no longer looked at it as a symbol of success. He was connected to it, and it was no longer possible to hide it. Friends began to disappear. Those who had previously supported him were now embarrassed by all this talk, these accusations, these threats. He began to lose control. He tried to compensate for this with money, tried to pay to make everything quiet, but it did not work. He was a puppet, and someone suddenly broke the strings. He could feel it. His world, which had seemed invincible, was starting to crumble. People weren't afraid of him. And that was the scariest part. He thought they would be bribed by his money. But something had changed. He was on his side. He wasn't on her side as always, but now he felt his world wobbling. He was losing control. He was starting to be afraid. He was afraid of those anonymous messages, those damn comments. He was afraid that he couldn't control his world anymore, that his reputation wasn't something he could fake with money and threats. It was more than just his position. It was about him, about what he had built, about what he thought was right, and now it was crumbling before his eyes. He couldn't just pay to make it go away. He couldn't just buy himself safety. He was trapped now, a trap of his own making, and she, standing outside the game, was his shadow. Everything he had once done with confidence and without consequence now filled him with fear. His business, his connections, his status, they meant nothing anymore. They were just a shell from which all his power was flowing. He felt his world slipping away, and perhaps that was the most painful thing. Not that he was losing money, but that he could not understand what was happening. He did not know who was behind it. He thought that no one could influence his situation. But now that the threat was real, he saw his world unravel. When one person takes action, when his story becomes not just a complaint, but proof that the system does not always work as it should, then everyone who stood in his way began to feel the change. And despite all his attempts, he could not stop the process that was already underway. Justice did not come in a uniform. It came through pain, through the pain that this person himself could inflict on everyone around him. And now he felt it, felt the world beginning to squeeze him out. He was losing everything he considered his. His threat had become his imprisonment, and this process was only at the beginning. When everything around you becomes empty, when you no longer see yourself as a person, but only as an instrument of revenge, there comes a moment when choice seems impossible. All this time, she felt her anger growing. It was not just a desire to punish the one who broke her world. It was part of who she was. She did not forgive. And even now, as she stood in front of his house, she was not sure that her choice was the right one. But one thing was clear. She could no longer stand aside. She could no longer afford to be an observer, a person who simply suffered in the shadows. Now she was standing at the door. He did not know she was here. He was busy, trying to rebuild his business, trying to restore the reputation he had lost in the past few weeks. His world was crumbling, and he did not understand what was happening. He did not know that this moment was inevitable. His entire world was built on harassment, on the merciless certainty that he was at the top. And now she was standing at his door, and this moment mattered. She could have simply taken her anger out on him, exacted revenge as brutally as he had broken her world. She could have burned his car, her eyes ablaze with rage. She could have done it the way he had done to her dog. She could have brought him to his knees and made him feel what it was like to be broken, to be helpless. But she knew that revenge would not restore her life. Revenge would not bring back her dog. Revenge would not give back what had been stolen. It would be as empty as his murderous indifference. She stood in front of his house, her heart pounding. She couldn't just walk away. She couldn't let him go. She saw him sitting in his chair, his face filled with fear, trying to maintain a semblance of calm. when everything inside him was already cracking. And in that moment, she knew that revenge was not what she needed. Revenge would be quick, but it would not bring satisfaction. Revenge wouldn't make him feel this endless fear, wouldn't make him wake up every morning knowing he had nowhere to run. She wouldn't be like him. She wouldn't be what he thought she was supposed to be. She was more than that. She was the one who could make him feel what he hadn't felt in years. She had to make him afraid every day. Let that be his punishment. She came closer. It was dark outside. Only the faint light from the street lamps fell on his house. She stopped in front of his door. There was no sound, no movement, but inside her, the storm continued to grow. He didn't know her footsteps were getting closer. He sat there sipping his beer like he thought it was over, that his reputation would be restored. But it wasn't. He didn't know that right now he would meet the one who would take everything from him. Quietly, without unnecessary noise, she looked out the window, and in that window, reflected back at her, she saw not only herself, but everything she had been through, everything he had done, everything she had lost, everything she had left behind. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't understand that he had been trapped all this time, that he had been imprisoned in his own certainties. She knelt down, coming closer, and saw his face change. He felt her presence. He turned around and saw her standing in the shadows. He didn't know what to do. He began to pray. He tried to convince her that it was wrong. He tried to tell her that it was an accident. He begged like a pathetic man who knew his world was falling apart. But she didn't hear him. He was broken, but not physically. She took his gaze and destroyed it. He was no longer the man everyone knew. He was the man who had lost everything. He was the man who had been abandoned in his fear, in his weakness. She didn't say a word. She didn't need words. He understood. He understood that he was now in her power. She didn't break him right away. She left him in that moment. She gave him no peace. He begged, but she left him in silence. She knew that his suffering would be more excruciating than any physical blow. She walked away, leaving him alone with his fear. In that moment, she understood that revenge is not about taking back what was stolen. Revenge is about destroying who you are. And in that moment, standing in the darkness, she knew that she had made the right choice. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from and whether you have ever experienced something similar in your life. It is important for us to know your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. He thought she came for revenge. He thought her anger and pain would be simple, like any other. He was wrong. He thought she would be like everyone else, looking for the one who humiliated her, to regain some of her lost pride. He thought she just wanted revenge. But it wasn't revenge. It was more than that. She didn't need revenge. She didn't want to become who he was. But she wanted him to become what he had despised for so long. Broken, humiliated, alone. She understood that real pain wasn't about physically destroying someone. Real pain was about taking away everything they considered theirs, about taking away what they valued most, what made their existence worth living. He had always looked down on people as empty shells that had to obey his will, his rules. He thought his position was secure, that his money and connections would protect him from all harm. He thought that power was his right and that he would always be on top. But now he was beginning to see that this was not so. Now he realized that his place was not at the top, but at the bottom, where he was beginning to be seen for who he really was. This was not a physical fight. She had not come to him to hit him or to destroy his life materially. She had come to take away from him what he had hidden from the world for so long, what he had tried so hard to build up within himself, his sense of security and confidence. She had come to take away his peace. He had thought that she would scream, that she would demand the truth, that she would tear apart his privacy, and then he could do something, maybe pay someone to make amends. But she demanded no words, no justice. She wanted nothing. She wanted only one thing, for him to become what he had humiliated for so long, to make him feel empty, worthless, as helpless as she had once been. And that was far worse than any revenge. She had not victimized him. She had victimized him. He had been wrong to think she would not have the strength. He had been wrong to think she would crumble and leave. She had come into his life to erase his confidence, to destroy his view of the world. She had not intended to voice her grievances against him. She was not going to be the one demanding justice from a system that would not listen to her. She had decided that justice would be in her hands, and when she began to plot her revenge, she did not take the easy way out. She used what he had put into her. She used his contempt, his disrespect, his hatred. She had forced him into the same horror that he had once sowed in her life. She had taken away his calm, his confidence, his greatness. Now he stood before what he had always rejected. He stood before her eyes, which were not full of pain, were not full of revenge. There was emptiness in her eyes, an emptiness that he himself had created. He knew that he had lost everything, but he did not understand what he had really lost. He thought that her life was nothing, that she was just another woman to do with as he pleased. He thought that he was powerful, but now, when everything that was him was crumbling, he could not believe that this was happening to him. He was afraid, because he realized that now he was alone. He was left without his power, without his reputation, without his friends. He was left alone with what he had done and with what he had hidden for so long. He had become what he had always despised, and this was something he could not predict. He tried to fight. He tried to find the strength within himself to take back everything he had lost. But what could he take back? He tried to pay for his life, for his freedom. But this freedom turned out to be an illusion. He thought he was strong, but now he felt his power slipping away. He was no longer the one who could control people, control events, control situations. He was the one who was losing everything. He begged. He stood in front of her and begged her to forgive him. He told her it was a mistake, that he didn't know she would be so strong, so determined. But she wouldn't listen to him. She didn't want forgiveness. She wasn't here to forgive him. She didn't want him to feel like a master again. She wanted him to feel what it was like to be nothing. Everything he'd done had come back to him. Not through revenge, not through physical violence, not through losing money, but through fear, through the emptiness that enveloped him when he realized his world was empty, that all his strength was just a facade. And now, as he begged her, she just stood in front of him, silent, and that was all it took for him to realize. He couldn't do anything anymore. His story was no longer his. It was no longer just the story of a man who knew how to control others, how to make them obey his laws, his fears, his hatreds. Now that story lived differently. It was no longer a complaint against society, against the bullying, against those who were too weak to understand what had happened. He was no longer a victim. He was now a symbol of the fall. He had become someone who had risen once but could not stay at the top. He had become an example of what happens when power ceases to be a right and becomes tyranny, when confidence turns to pride and pride to humiliation. It was not just his mistake. It was the mistake of the society that had allowed him to remain on a pedestal for so long. He was a living reminder of how flawed that system was, how easy it was to lose everything if you could only see your power in yourself. There was no longer that fire in his eyes that had once lit up his chest when he thought he was untouchable. Now he was just a waste of his own tyranny. But he was not alone. Her story was on everyone's lips, and she was no longer just a woman who had lost her dog. She was no longer someone who remained silent, who waited, who suffered. Her name had become a symbol, not as a victim, but as someone who had taken her fate into her own hands and turned it around. She had become someone who was no longer afraid, someone who had stood up to the system and brought about change. Her voice was no longer just an echo in the void. Her actions, her determination, had become an idea. She had become an example for those who lived in silence, for those who were used to being afraid. She was someone who had risen up after everything had been taken from her. She was no longer just a woman fighting for justice. She had become the living embodiment of what happens when you stop being a victim. And now everyone knew her name, but it was not something she enjoyed. She was not proud of it. Her pride was in the fact that she had stood firm, in the fact that she had gone through all of this and not given up. She did not preach revenge, did not shout about how important it was to punish everyone who stood in her way. She was simply herself, and that was her greatness. She continued to live, and that was her victory. She moved on, without looking back, with a new life inside, with new confidence, with new freedom. She no longer depended on other people's looks, on other people's words, on what others thought about her place in this world. She was strong, and this strength did not come from revenge or hatred. It came from the fact that she was finally free. She felt that her life mattered again, but she knew that it was not that simple. She knew that her story was not over. She did not disappear, did not forget what had happened. The memory of her dog, of what she had lost, was with her. The memory of the one who gave his life for her was with her. She couldn't forget. But she didn't let that memory rule her. She didn't let those memories hold her back. She moved forward, not with hatred, not with anger. She moved with what she had lived through and what she had overcome. And that was her true strength. She didn't seek recognition. She didn't seek support. She only sought her truth. She moved forward, knowing that her steps were not just a path to betterment, but a path to herself. And let no one forget. Let no one forget what happened. Let no one forget how silence can be a terrible weapon, and how important it is not to let it destroy you. She became a symbol of how you can survive in the most difficult conditions, not break down, not become the one who suffers alone. She became a living reminder that we can be strong, that we can get back everything we have lost if we don't allow ourselves to forget that we are human. And that was her greatness. What do you think about this story? We would love to hear your opinion in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us. We appreciate each of you and are grateful that you are with us. Support us with a like and a subscription so you don't miss new stories. Have a great day. Write a phrase in the comments that will show that you got to the end. We are always happy to hear from you.